The stagecoach stopped. It didn't just stop, it lurched, throwing a cloud of red dust so thick it was like the world had caught fire. Nora Hart clutched her worn carpet bag, her knuckles white. It wasn't just a bag. It was her life rope, the only thing keeping her from falling off the edge of the world. Ahead of her, Elk Fork Station wasn't a town. It was a suggestion of one. A few tired buildings leaning against a wind that had teeth. The air smelled of pine smoke, horse sweat, and endings. The driver tipped his hat. "End of the line, miss." She stepped down. The wooden planks of the platform groaned, a long, weary sound, like an old man getting out of bed. Men stopped what they were doing. They stared. Not with malice, just a deep, heavy curiosity. A mail-order bride wasn't a circus act out here, but it was close enough. She felt their eyes on her dress, her bag, her face. They were looking for the cracks, looking for the desperation. She lifted her chin, the way she'd learned to in Boston. Dignity was armor, and hers was polished bright, even if it was dented underneath. Inside her bag, she had three things: a marriage contract, cold and official, a silver locket holding her mother's face, and a worn shawl it was wrapped in. That was it. Everything she was, everything she had left, was in that bag. "Miss Hart?" The voice was deep. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind like a sharp axe through pine. She turned. The man who spoke looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself. Broad shoulders strained the fabric of a flannel shirt that had seen years of work. His hands were huge, crisscrossed with scars that told stories of splinters and steel. Gray streaked his dark hair like frost on winter branches. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were the color of a winter sky, clear and quiet. He stood apart from the others. He didn't stare. He watched. "Mr. McCrae," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Folks call me Stone," he said. It wasn't a nickname. It was a fact. "This all you brought?" She nodded. Yes. She'd sold everything else. Every teacup, every book, every memory she could part with, just to pay for the ticket that brought her here. He gave a single, short nod and took the bag from her. His fingers, rough as bark, brushed against hers. For a man who looked like he could wrestle a bear, his touch was surprisingly careful. "Wagon's this way," he said, turning without another word. "Got a piece to go before dark." The wagon was like him, plain, sturdy, built to last. A clean blanket was folded neatly on the bench. He helped her up, his hands strong on her waist, lifting her as if she were made of fine china. She wanted to tell him she was tougher than that she'd scrub floors on her hands and knees until her knuckles were raw, that she knew what work was. But she held her tongue. Out here, words were worth less than actions. They rolled out of the tiny settlement, the wheels crunching on the gravel road. The road began to climb, winding between pine trees that were so tall they seemed to hold up the sky. Mountains rose up in the distance, jagged and blue, like a wall between her and the rest of the world. Stone held the reins with a calm, steady grip. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was watchful. "Winter comes early here," he said finally, his eyes on the horizon. "Wood's mostly split. Root cellar needs filling. Stock needs tending." It wasn't a complaint. It was a list, a statement of facts. "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. McCrae." She called him that on purpose. Stone felt too familiar. He glanced at her, and for the first time she saw something shift in those winter sky eyes. A flicker of something that might have been approval. "Good," he said, just that one word. The wind picked up, colder now, and she pulled her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders. This was it. No lace veil, no organ music. Just a contract in a bag and a quiet man who smelled of sawdust and leather, driving her toward a life she couldn't even begin to imagine. She had to say it. She had to say it now before they got there. Before he saw the home he'd built and she poisoned it with a truth she'd been carrying like a stone in her own heart. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, the words catching in her throat, "about why I answered your notice." He didn't even look at her. He just kept his eyes on the road, on the horses, on the mountains ahead. If it's about what them Boston doctors said, he said, his voice as even as the rumble of the wagon wheels, I already know. Nora's breath caught in her chest. The air suddenly felt thin, too thin to breathe. She stared at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw. How? How could he possibly know? In her third letter, after weeks of agonizing, she had written the truth. The shameful clinical words the doctor had used. Tilted womb, unlikely to carry a child to term. Her former fiancé, Edmund, had called off the wedding the day his mother found out. It was a defect. She was damaged goods. You were honest in your letters, Stone said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Then why me? She whispered. You want a family, sons to help with the land. I can't promise that. He was quiet for a long moment. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the sigh of the wind in the pines. She thought he might not answer, that he might just turn the wagon around and take her back to the station, her shame complete. I've seen a lightning strike burn a strong oak to the ground, he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. And I've seen a crooked sapling stand through a blizzard that flattened a whole stand of timber. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes held hers. Doctors know about bodies. They don't know everything. I want a home. I want a wife. Someone to build with. Children are in God's hands, not ours. The question ain't, can you? The question is, will you? Will you try? Will you want them if they come? His words settled over her, heavy and warm as a quilt. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation, an offer to share a hope he had no reason to have. They crested a rise, and he pointed ahead with his chin. There, down in a small meadow, nestled against a dark wall of forest, was a cabin. It was small and simple, but it stood straight and true. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the deep blue sky. A neat little barn stood beside it, its doors open. There was a garden mostly harvested for the winter, and a row of young apple trees, their branches bare but full of promise. It was perfect. It was a picture of peace. You built this, she said. It wasn't a question. Every board, he said. Took me 3 years, another 2 to prove up the land. He stopped the wagon by the porch and jumped down. He came around and lifted her to the ground, his hands just as strong and careful as before. Come inside. I'll see to the horses after. The inside was as honest as the outside, clean, spare, and strong. A big stone fireplace dominated one wall, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves holding a few plates and jars of preserves. There was a small bedroom off the main room, with a bed covered in a worn but clean quilt, and another even smaller room, with just a narrow cot. You take the bedroom, Stone said, not looking at her. He gestured toward the cot. I'll bunk out here until you're comfortable. It was more kindness than she had ever expected. Edmund had spoken of a husband's rights, a wife's duties. He had never once spoken of comfort. Thank you, she whispered. There's stew on the stove, he said, his hand already on the door. Bread's in the box. I'll be outside. She watched him go. Then slowly she began to unpack. She hung her 2 other dresses on wooden pegs. She placed her mother's Bible on the small table by the bed. She opened the silver locket and looked at the tiny, faded photograph of her mother's face. A woman who had also married a stranger for a better life and had found love in an unexpected place. She prayed her own story would end as well. When Stone came back in, his face scrubbed clean and his hair damp, she had 2 bowls of stew on the table. He rolled up his sleeves to wash his hands at the basin, and she saw his forearms. They were thick with muscle, corded and strong, but they were also covered in old scars. A long, thin white line that ran from his wrist to his elbow. A puckered circle on his shoulder. This was a man who had seen trouble. They ate in that same comfortable silence. It wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. The quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill the air with noise. But the question he'd asked in the wagon still hung between them. Finally, she had to answer it. She looked up from her bowl and met his gaze. He didn't look away. Yes, she said, her voice clear and firm. I will. Stone nodded, a single decisive movement, like a man driving a nail home in one clean stroke. Then we'll make do with whatever comes. The next morning she was up before him, coaxing the fire back to life in the big iron stove. She found flour and yeast and set to making bread, the familiar rhythm of kneading the dough a comfort in this strange new place. But as she worked, her eyes drifted to the small, second bedroom, the one with the cot. He had said he would sleep there until she was comfortable, but then she saw something else. Tucked into the corner, half hidden by a folded blanket, was a small wooden horse. Its paint was faded, and one of its rockers was worn smooth, as if from years of use by a small child. Her blood ran cold. He had said he wanted a home with voices in it besides his own. He had never said his home had always been quiet. The wooden horse sat in the corner, a silent testament to a life he hadn't mentioned, a secret hidden in plain sight. Nora felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. Who was this man really? Had he been married before? Did he have a child? A child he hadn't told her about? The cabin, which had felt like a safe, sturdy haven just moments before, now felt filled with ghosts. She pushed the thought away. She had to. She was his wife now. She had made a promise. She baked the bread. It burned. The stove was different from the one in Boston, its heat fierce and uneven. When Stone came in from his morning chores, the smell of scorched flour filled the small cabin. He didn't say a word about it. He just took the blackened loaf from her hands, broke off a piece of the less burnt part, and ate it. Needs a lighter hand on the damper, he said, his voice gentle. This old iron holds its heat. You gotta listen to it. He showed her how, his large, scarred hand next to hers on the cool metal lever. He wasn't teaching her. He was sharing knowledge. They fell into a rhythm. The days were marked by the sun and the work that needed doing. He split wood, the axe falling in a clean, powerful arc. She stacked it in neat rows against the cabin wall. He taught her how to read the clouds, how to know when a storm was gathering over the mountains. On Sunday, they hitched the wagon and drove to town. The church was a simple log building, and it smelled of pine needles and old beeswax. A few neighbors came, their faces a mixture of curiosity and kindness. The Reverend was a thin man with a warm smile. Stone didn't have a gold ring. Instead, he had carved 2 rings from a piece of pale, smooth pine wood. They were simple, but they fit perfectly. When he spoke his vows, his voice was low and clear, a promise that felt as solid as the mountains around them. I will provide, he said, looking right at her. I will protect. I will build with you, not over you. When it was her turn, her own voice shook, but she didn't falter. I will work beside you, she promised. I will make this house a home. I will try. I will always try. The kiss he gave her was brief, almost shy, but the look in his eyes afterward was anything but. It was steady and sure, and it made her feel safer than she had in her entire life. That night back at the cabin, the tension was thick enough to touch. He stood by the door to the main room, looking at the bed, then at the cot. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. You take the bed, he said finally. Like I said, no expectations. He turned to go to the tiny room with the cot and the little wooden horse. Wait, she said. He stopped, his back to her. The little horse, she said, her heart pounding. Was it your son's? He stood completely still for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. When he finally turned around, the look on his face was one of deep, old sorrow. I had a wife, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Her name was Sarah. She died birthing our son. He followed her 3 days later. He looked at the floor. I built this place for them, for the life we were supposed to have. He finally looked up at her, his eyes raw. I should have told you. I'm sorry. The secret wasn't a betrayal. It was a wound, a deep, terrible wound he had been carrying alone. Nora crossed the small room in 3 steps and took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. You don't have to sleep on the cot, she whispered. This is your home. This is your bed. He looked from her face to the bed, and 1,000 emotions seemed to pass through his eyes. Hope, fear, grief, and something else. something new. He followed her into the bedroom, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was where she was meant to be. This was home. And that night she didn't just feel safe, she felt chosen. Winter came down from the mountains like a wolf, silent and white and hungry. The snow piled up in deep drifts, burying the fences and turning the world into a vast, empty sea of white. The cabin became their entire world, a small, warm ship in a frozen ocean. They learned the landscape of each other, the way he hummed a tuneless song when he was carving by the firelight, the way she sang old hymns under her breath when she was kneading bread, her hands sure and steady now. He taught her to shoot, his big body warm behind hers as he showed her how to hold the rifle, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. "Don't force it," he said, his voice a low rumble by her ear. "Just ask it." On the third try, she hit the tin can they'd set on the fence post, and a rare, wide smile split his face, warming the frigid air. One night, when the wind howled so hard it seemed to be trying to tear the roof off, he brought a bundle of wood in from the barn. It wasn't firewood. The pieces were smooth, carefully cut. He laid them on the table. "Started this a long time back," he said, not looking at her. For him, it was a cradle, unfinished. The headboard was carved with wild roses, like the ones that grew by the creek in the summer. He had stopped working on it the day his son died. He ran a hand over the smooth wood. Thought, thought maybe we could finish it," he said, his voice thick. "Together." So they did. Night after night, they sat by the fire, sanding the spindles, rubbing them with oil until the wood glowed with a soft, warm light. Their hands would brush, and a different kind of warmth would spread through Nora's chest. One night he stopped sanding and just looked at her. "You smell like bread and wood smoke," he said softly. "Is that good?" she asked, her voice a little shy. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear. "It's home," he said. And then it happened. One morning, a wave of nausea sent her running for the porch, where she was sick in the snow. "Must have been the stew," she said, her face pale, though they had eaten the same thing. It happened again the next day, and the day after that. Stone didn't say anything. He just stood behind her, his large hand a steady, warm presence between her shoulder blades. On the fourth morning, as she washed her face in the basin, he came and stood beside her. "Nora," he said, his voice careful, "when was your last monthly time?" She stopped. The cloth dripped water onto the floor. She counted the weeks in her head. 1, 2, 3, 7. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. Hope, fierce and terrifying, surged through her, a spark landing on the driest tinder. "I'm not always regular," she whispered, the old fear trying to choke the new hope. "Doctors can be wrong," he said. And the way he said it, it wasn't a guess. It was a statement of faith. He took her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers in a promise. The cabin, already warm, seemed to grow brighter. The fire burned with more cheer. The sun, when it broke through the winter clouds, seemed to shine just for them. Every evening Stone worked on the cradle. The soft rasp of the sandpaper was like a prayer in the quiet room. Nora found herself humming more, her steps lighter, a secret smile playing on her lips. She would lay a hand on her still flat belly and imagine a tiny heart beating in time with her own, a life, a child, a miracle. Then after a blizzard that lasted 3 days and nights, sealing them in completely, she woke up to a dull, low ache in her back. A familiar dread coiled in her stomach. She told herself it was nothing, just the baby settling in. But the ache grew, tightening into a mean, sharp cramp. A little while later, she felt a sudden warmth spread between her legs. She knew. She didn't cry out. She didn't wake Stone. She crept out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. In the faint light from the banked fire, she saw the blood, a dark stain spreading on her nightgown. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. It was the end of the dream. She cleaned herself up, hiding the stained cloths deep in the laundry basket, under Stone's work clothes. She moved like a ghost, silent and numb. When Stone came in from the barn later that morning, stamping the snow from his boots, she was standing at the table, a knife in her hand, peeling potatoes for a stew she had no appetite for. He took one look at her face. It was as white as the snow outside. He didn't ask what was wrong. He knew. He walked over to her, gently took the knife from her hand, and set it on the table. "Go rest," he said, his voice thick with a pain that mirrored her own. He finished making the supper. He stoked the fire. He didn't say another word. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was heavy, suffocating, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. That night in the dark of their bed, he reached for her. She flinched and turned away, curling into a tight, miserable ball. "Don't," she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm sorry." He didn't move away. Instead, he moved closer, wrapping his big, strong body around her, pulling her back against his chest. He held her tight, as if he could piece her broken heart back together with his own strength. "There is nothing to be sorry for," he murmured into her hair. "Nothing." He rested his chin on the top of her head. "The cradle, it's just wood. It's just pretty shaped wood. It'll hold whatever we put in it, full or empty." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "We'll believe again when we can." Grief was a heavy burden, but for the first time in her life, she didn't have to carry it alone. Winter finally broke. The ice on the creek shattered with a sound like a gunshot, and the world turned to mud. When the road was finally passable, they hitched the wagon and drove to town for supplies. Nora felt a change in herself. This wasn't just Stone's Valley anymore. It was theirs. These were their neighbors. This was their life. She felt a fragile new shoot of peace beginning to grow in the barren ground of her grief. The stagecoach was just pulling in as they were loading their wagon, kicking up the same cloud of dust she remembered from her own arrival. A man stepped out. A man in a fine black suit and polished city boots that were completely out of place in the muddy street. He took off his hat, and Nora's blood turned to ice in her veins. It was Edmund Vale, her former fiancé. He looked thinner, his face pale, but his eyes were the same, cold, assessing, proprietary. He saw her and a slow, confident smile spread across his face. "Nora," he said, as if they had just spoken yesterday. He walked toward her, his eyes flicking over Stone with dismissal, as if he were a hired man. "I am so terribly sorry for your loss." Nora's hand flew to her stomach. How could he know? How could this man from a world away know about the baby? "Which loss are you referring to, Edmund?" she asked, her voice sharp and cold. "The one you manufactured, or the one you used as an excuse to throw me away?" Stone moved to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but she felt his strength, his presence, like a solid wall at her back. Edmund's smile tightened. "I was wrong," he said, his voice slick with false sincerity. "I've spoken to new physicians in Boston, specialists from Europe. They have methods now, Nora. Techniques. They believe your condition is treatable. Come back with me. We can try again. With science." He made it sound like an offer, a rescue. But Nora heard the truth beneath the words. He wasn't offering to heal her. He was offering to fix her, to make her worthy of him. "I have a husband," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I have a home." "This?" Edmund sneered, gesturing at the muddy street, the simple wagon. "What can this man give you? A dirt floor and cold nights?" His eyes slid over Stone again, full of contempt. "Respect," Stone said. Just one word. It landed like a hammer blow. Edmund's face went rigid. His mask of concern dropped, revealing the cold ambition beneath. "I'll be staying at the hotel for 1 week," he said, his voice clipped. "Think about my offer, Nora. Think very carefully about what you're throwing away." He turned and walked away without waiting for an answer. He didn't have to. He was a man who always got what he wanted. And as he walked away, Nora saw him exchange a subtle nod with another man leaning against the general store. A man she recognized. A neighbor who had been nothing but kind to them. A cold dread washed over her. Edmund hadn't come here to persuade her. He had come here to win, and he had already laid his plans. The very next day, the town marshal rode out to their homestead. He wasn't alone. 2 deputies were with him, along with a weaselly-looking clerk from the land office. And of course, Edmund Vale, looking smug and serene. "Stone," the marshal said, and he had the decency to look ashamed. "I'm sorry. I have to serve you with these." He held out a sheaf of folded papers. "A legal challenge has been filed against your claim on this homestead." Stone took the papers, his face unreadable. He scanned the dense legal text. "It says here," the clerk piped up, his voice oily, "that you abandoned the property for a period exceeding 6 months back in '81, which according to the Homestead Act forfeits your claim." "'81!" A voice boomed from the road. It was their neighbor Tom Pike riding up on his horse. "That's when he was riding with the posse. We deputized him ourselves to go after the Lowry gang." The clerk smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Was that deputization filed in writing with the territorial office? Is there an official record of his service?" He already knew the answer. "Because the law is quite clear. Without a formal filing, any absence over 6 months is considered abandonment." Edmund stepped forward, his face a mask of polite concern. "This is all just a legal formality, of course," he said smoothly. "A regrettable but necessary part of ensuring order. However, to ease the trouble for Nora, I am prepared to purchase the land from the territory at a fair market price. I will see she is taken care of." He wasn't just trying to take her back. He was trying to erase Stone, to wipe him off the map, to take his land, his home, the very ground he stood on. "You don't want the land," Nora said, her voice shaking with rage. "You want me. You want to own me, just like you want to own this property." Edmund's eyes went cold as ice. "I want to restore what was broken, Nora." "You broke it," Stone said, his voice dangerously quiet. He folded the papers and handed them back to the marshal. "We'll see you in court." They had 7 days. 7 days to fight a legal system that was built on paper, not on truth. 7 days to prove that a man's life, his sweat, his blood, mattered more than a missing signature on a dusty form in a territorial office miles away. The fight wasn't just for a piece of land. It was a fight for their life, for their home. And as Nora looked at Edmund's triumphant smirk, she knew he believed he had already won. Because in his world, a man like Stone McCrae didn't stand a chance against a man with money, connections, and a complete disregard for the truth. The cabin became a war room. Nora's hand cramped from writing letters to anyone and everyone who might remember Stone's service with the posse. Stone rode from sunup to sundown, visiting every homesteader in the valley, asking them to stand with him. Some men shuffled their feet and looked at the ground, afraid to cross a rich man from the east. But most of them looked Stone in the eye, remembered the time he'd helped them raise a barn or pull a calf from a ditch, and said, "We'll be there." The women of the valley rallied around Nora. They brought food, they watched the stock, and they spread the word. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, dug out an old ledger. In it, she had meticulously recorded every purchase made by their neighbor, Samuel Briggs, on Stone's behalf while he was away. Salt for the cattle, nails for a loose shutter, feed for the horses. It was a record of life continuing, of a home being maintained, not abandoned. The Reverend wrote a statement in his elegant, firm script. The doctor, a crusty old man who had seen it all, wrote one too, describing in detail the rustler's bullet he'd pulled from Stone's shoulder the year after the supposed abandonment. The day of the hearing, the tiny courthouse was packed to the rafters. It smelled of wet wool, mud, and anxious sweat. Every man who had said "we'll be there" was there. Their faces were grim, their hats held in their hands. The judge was a young man, new to the territory, his face looking nervous and eager to please behind the tall wooden bench. Edmund sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a man named Cornelius Hatch, who looked like a well-dressed snake. Hatch laid out his case with slick, undeniable logic. "The law, Your Honor, is not sentimental. The statute is clear. Continuous residence is required. No official filing was made to exempt Mr. McCrae. 3 witnesses," he gestured to 3 rough-looking men sitting in the back, "have sworn affidavits that they passed this way in the autumn of '81 and found the cabin empty, cold, and clearly abandoned." He presented the affidavits. He even had the marshal's report, quoting Stone's own admission that he'd been gone near 6 months. It was a cage of paper, and every bar was perfectly in place. When it was Stone's turn, he stood tall and spoke plainly. "Those men are lying," he said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "And they're sloppy liars. They say they saw the cabin abandoned in the fall of '81. But any man who lives in this valley knows the Great Flood was in the spring of '82. The bridge they claim to have crossed to get to my land didn't exist in '81. It was washed out and wasn't rebuilt till the next summer." A murmur went through the crowd. "Do you have written proof of this?" the young judge asked, looking uncomfortable. "We have our memories," Stone said. "We kept faith with each other, not with paper." One by one, his neighbors stood up. Tom Pike swore he had deputized Stone himself. The marshal, looking ashamed, nodded his agreement. Mrs. Henderson held up her ledger, its pages a testament to neighborly trust. The doctor read his notes about the bullet. The Reverend spoke of blessing the house upon Stone's return. It was a powerful chorus of community, a wall of spoken truth. But Hatch just smiled his thin, cold smile. "Inspiring stories, Your Honor. Truly. But stories do not change statutes. The law is the law. The land belongs to the territory now, and my client is prepared to make a generous offer." Nora felt the air go out of the room. He was right. Their truth was heavy, but the law was sharp. Paper was going to beat people. Edmund was going to win. She reached for Stone's hand under the table. His fingers were steady, but she could feel a fine tremor running through them. He was going to lose everything he had ever built. The judge sighed. He looked at the law books. He looked at the faces of the homesteaders. He looked at Edmund's smug lawyer. "If there is nothing further," he said, his voice full of regret, and he picked up his gavel. The sound of the courtroom door slamming open echoed like a cannon shot. Every head whipped around. A man stood in the doorway, blocking the light. He was tall and broad, wearing a dusty duster, and on his chest was a shining silver star. A United States Marshal. "There's plenty further, Judge," the man said, his voice like gravel. And behind him, two deputies shoved the three trapper witnesses into the room. They weren't just being escorted, they were in chains. The U.S. Marshal John Randall strode to the front of the courtroom, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He tossed a thick file onto the judge's bench. "These men, Your Honor," he said, pointing a thumb back at the shackled trappers, "are part of a conspiracy. They don't trap animals. They trap land. I have papers here from 3 different territories showing them bearing false witness in fraudulent claim-jumping cases, all orchestrated by the same man." He spun around and leveled a finger directly at the slick lawyer, Cornelius Hatch, whose face had gone the color of spoiled milk. "You, sir, are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud." Hatch made a strangled noise and bolted for a side door. But Tom Pike, moving with surprising speed for a man his age, stuck out a thick leather boot. Hatch went down hard, his face skidding on the dusty floorboards. The entire courtroom erupted. Men were on their feet, shouting, cheering, pounding each other on the back. "Order! Order!" Judge Whitmore yelled, banging his gavel, but a wide grin was spreading across his own face. The federal deputies hauled the sputtering Hatch to his feet. Randall wasn't finished. He turned his cold, hard gaze on the last man at the table. "As for you, Mr. Vale," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low, "my star witness," he jerked his head toward one of the trappers, who was now trembling like a leaf, "has signed a full confession. He says you paid him and the others in gold coin to commit perjury. You're under arrest for bribery, fraud, and conspiracy." The judge slammed his gavel down. "This court finds the claim of Stone McCrae to be valid, proven, and protected. Case dismissed." The room exploded. Nora was crying, laughing, being hugged by women she barely knew. Stone's neighbors were slapping his back, shaking his hand, their faces shining with victory. Edmund stood alone, his fine suit now splattered with mud from Hatch's fall, his face a pale mask of disbelief. As the deputies clamped iron cuffs on his wrists, his eyes found Nora's across the cheering room. "I only wanted you to have the life you deserved," he rasped, his voice hollow. "No, Edmund," Nora said, her own voice clear and strong enough for everyone to hear. "You only wanted to own me, but my life, my husband, my home, they are not for sale." Outside, the spring sun was warm and bright. The whole town seemed to be celebrating. Someone was passing around a bottle of whiskey. Kids were running and shouting the news. But Stone just pulled Nora close, his arm wrapping tight around her. "Let's go home," he said. That night the cabin felt different. It felt consecrated. It was more than just wood and stone. It was a fortress they had defended, a sanctuary they had won. The unfinished cradle stood in the corner, not as a symbol of loss, but as a vessel for a future they would build on their own terms. Stone held her, his grip fierce and tender, as if he might never let go. "It's ours," she whispered into his chest. "No," he said softly, his lips against her hair. "It's home. That's more than owning." They made love that night, not with the quiet gentleness of new beginnings, but with the passionate, triumphant certainty of a battle won. They were claiming each other, and the life they had fought for, with every touch. Afterward, lying with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart, she felt a profound sense of peace. "Tomorrow," she murmured, already drifting to sleep. "Tomorrow we'll finish the cradle." And this time, she knew it would not stay empty for long. The years that followed were like a slow, deep river, flowing steady and sure. The doctors in Boston, with all their cold science, had been wrong. The mountain air, the hard work, the steady love of a good man, whatever it was, it had healed something in her that medicine couldn't touch. First came Margaret, a rosy-cheeked baby with Stone's calm gray eyes and Nora's stubborn chin. She filled the cabin with a kind of joy so pure it almost hurt to look at it. The cradle finally finished, rocked her to sleep each night. 2 years later, Samuel was born, a strong boy with a wild tuft of dark hair, named for the grumpy neighbor who had stood by them in court. The cabin grew as the family did. Stone added a room, then another. His hammer blows a familiar song in the valley. The rocking chair he'd carved that first lonely winter now sat by the fire, always occupied, a patchwork quilt Nora had stitched draped over its back. Each patch told a piece of their story, a scrap from her wedding dress, a piece of a flour sack, the soft flannel of a baby's first gown. Sometimes in the long snow-hushed winters, Nora would look at her family, bathed in the warm glow of the firelight. Stone reading a book, Margaret braiding her hair, Samuel asleep with his head in her lap, and she would feel a gratitude so immense it filled her chest to bursting. This was substance. This was real. The life Edmund had offered her in Boston was a pale, flimsy shadow compared to this. One day a letter arrived, bearing a Boston postmark. It was from Edmund's sister. She wrote that Edmund had served his time in prison and had been released, a broken man. She said he spoke of repentance, of understanding at last the value of what he had tried to possess and destroy. Nora read the letter once, then calmly walked to the stove and fed the piece of paper to the flames. She watched it curl into black ash and disappear. Some doors were meant to stay closed forever. Many years later, when their hair was more silver than not, they sat together on the porch swing Stone had built. The stars were brilliant diamonds scattered across a black velvet sky. Margaret, a young woman now, was inside humming a soft tune as she mended a shirt for her brother. Samuel was already married, with a baby of his own, living on a homestead just over the next rise. Stone's arm was warm and heavy around her shoulders. "You ever miss it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Boston? The fancy dresses? The life you could have had?" Nora leaned her head against his shoulder. She could smell the familiar, comforting sense of wood smoke and clean earth that always clung to him. "How can I miss a shadow?" she said softly. "That life wasn't mine, Stone. It was a story someone else was trying to write for me. Here," she squeezed his hand, "we wrote our own story, plank by plank, year by year." She looked out at the dark mountains, standing guard over their valley, over their home. "We built a life that will last." He kissed her then, a slow, familiar kiss that still, after all these years, made her heart feel full. The wind sighed through the tall pine trees, carrying their story out into the night. A story of a mail-order bride who was told she was broken, and a mountain man who knew that the strongest things are often the ones that have had to mend. It was a love story not of sudden fire, but of a steady, warming flame that could outlast any storm. A love that was, and always would be, evergreen. Thank you for joining me for this story of Nora and Stone. Their journey was filled with hardship and unexpected turns, but they proved that true strength is found in partnership and perseverance. If you enjoyed watching them build a life against all odds, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, what was the moment in their story that moved you the most?